Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Cybersecurity series with me, Chirag Joshi. I'm your CISO who tries to make things accessible and easily understandable to all of us. We live in a complex world, as we know, but hopefully through this series, we shared some practical, pragmatic insights on things that actually matter to us cyber professionals and the broader industry. Now, today I have somebody who I'm really excited to join me again on this series. David Fairman. David's actually been on one of our earlier episodes where he shared so many exciting insights about art of cyber entrepreneurship, an area which has become even more prominent than when David and I met to record that podcast now getting close to a year back. How time has flown. For those of you who don't know David is a luminary in our industry, well respected, not just here in Australia, but across APAC and more globally. David is currently the CIO and CISO at Netscope, and he's also a partner and CISO in residence at 630 Ventures. David has a whole list of accomplishments that I'm going to share in the show notes, but if we start talking about that, I always say it's going to take up the full show. But that being said, though, I still want to introduce David formally and have him talk a little bit about all the exciting things he's done, and then we'll get into a big topic for today, and a topic that I'm really, been chomping at the bits to discuss more is Australian Cybersecurity Strategy 2023 to 2030. David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us again. And over to you, my friend. Anything that you want to share about yourself? You do so many exciting things, but anything that you want to call out for the audience?
Thanks, Chirag. It's great to be here as always. Look, I'll keep this pretty short. I guess the last 3 and a bit years of my life have been very much focused on the technology working for a technology company, a cybersecurity company, and very much in the venture capital innovation startup space. Prior to that, I was a long time banking, finance, CISO, CSO, if you like. So the CSO for National Australia Bank, ran everything from fraud investigations, physical, cyber, etc. Prior to that, Group CISO, RBC, global head of tech risk for JP Morgan, and a couple of CISO roles for Royal Bank of Scotland in different regions. So long-time banking finance practitioner. Now I find myself back to my roots in the technology space. So it's been a nice change for me, and it's exciting to be engaged in such an innovative, exciting industry, particularly now with cyber. It's a great time to be involved.
Yeah. And look, I mean, you've given so much to the industry, and you continue to do so, and we're all very grateful for it. I know the industry respects all your contributions and innovations you made. You made a lot of innovations, even with your time at NAB and others, which are still being, replicated, leveraged, and people look up to that. So really excited to have you to discuss this important topic today of our Australian cybersecurity strategy. So for those of you who are not aware, Australia has stated our ambition to become the world's most cybersecurity nation by 2030, which is obviously a very ambitious goal and objective to achieve. Here in Australia, the backdrop has been we've been faced with a lot of, I think, we talk about a big 3 cyber breaches that hit Australia, but there actually have been more, and the conversations everywhere have been around improving our resilience as a nation, because we've been impacted severely. Millions of records for which have been exposed over this time. I won't go into specific breaches; they're well documented, but that's the backdrop which we are working towards. So there is a lot of scrutiny on this topic, which is why the strategy was so widely awaited by the industry. And this is a quick snapshot. It's obviously goes from 2023 to 2030, which is a really long-term horizon for a cyber strategy. And it was just recently released 3 weeks back. So 2023 is almost done, but we still have six years ahead of us. And the strategy is broken into 3 horizons, which makes sense, where you start with building the foundations, you scale up, and then largely you try to have more leadership across the globe and the region. There are 6 shields in the strategy. Go everything from building stronger and resilient citizens and businesses, all the way up to a more global leadership when it comes to Australia's position as a cyber leader. Now, David, obviously we'll share a bunch of links in the show notes for the strategy in more detail, but I want to jump straight into it, right? we've had some time now to digest it, which is why I wanted to do it a couple of weeks after it was launched, as opposed to just reacting to something which wasn't fleshed out just yet. What are your initial reactions to the strategy, first of all, right? What stood out to you as the great things, and what stood out to you as areas where you thought could have been better?
Okay, so I think a couple of good things that I think we can talk about are the industry consultation that the government went through in forming this strategy. They didn't do it in a silo. They engaged. I was in Canberra last week, 2 weeks ago, and I think they said that there was over 400 industry consultation meetings in preparation of that, which took place over the course of just over 12 months. So that's a huge amount of industry consultation. I can see I was involved in some of those workshops. I can see looking at the strategy that the government listened to industry and they took a lot of that on board. So firstly, I'd like to applaud the government for doing that. I think that was, a great thing. And I think what comes through in terms of a great thing for me and something that's been done well in the strategy is the theme of needing to engage and collaborate with industry. And this isn't just a government problem to solve. And actually, I think it needs to I would say it needs to go a little bit further. It's just not collaboration with industry. There's also an element around personal accountability for each and every resident and citizen in the country. There is a personal accountability about cybersecurity and safety and what we need to do to protect ourselves as users in this digital ecosystem. So I think there's a piece around that. And actually, one of the shields is about as you mentioned, it's about the more resilient and cyber secure individuals and citizens, and the training and awareness that we're going to need to implement across the country to uplift that skill set for the ordinary everyday citizen and resident, which I think is, that's going to be a big challenge, obviously. I think, the leadership position that Australia wants to take, I think we're well poised to do that. I think we collaborate very well and push the industry a little bit. If I think of the ransomware task force, which we lead across the globe, we've got some great foundations there to work with. Obviously, very active in the Five Eyes partnership with AUKUS coming through. So we have a number of elements there where we can really assert influence, and I think that will be, very beneficial. In terms of things, what could have been done a bit more? Look, I think there's a lot of critics out there today. I think what the government have done is taken a measured approach to being realistic about where we are as a country and what the overall awareness and security posture looks like from the country, and to implement hard and fast rules in a very quick way. I like to use the term, you don't want to break yourself into jail. It's going to take time to take people on that journey, and we're going to have to do that collectively. So for me, I don't think it was necessarily a need to go and do anything more. I think I've heard a lot of people talk about harder mandates, more mandatory requirements. I think there's an element of realism to say, well, that's not going to work initially. So what I think with this timeline and this 3-phase timeline, I think we're going to see it change. Like you say, 7 years is a long time for a strategy. And I think what we'll start to see is a maturation of where we are as a country. And we will learn from that, and we'll start to raise the bar as we proceed. But one thing I will call out, mate, we keep talking about the Essential 8. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Australian sort of standards, we talk about an Essential 8, which is a standard that our Australian Cybersecurity Centre, or actually ASD, Australian Signals Directorate, released a few years back. I think the first iteration was around 2014, 2015. We talk about these 8 basic controls. We're still talking about that in 2023. I think really it's time for us to move on from an Essential 8 and move to a more holistic cybersecurity framework, something that is internationally recognized, something like the NIST cybersecurity framework as an example.
Well, yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, David. Couldn't agree more. And it's and by the way, just for the audience, if you notice a slight lag in the video, it's we having some technical difficulties, but we'll work through it. I think the as long as our voices come across, that's more important. So David, you obviously touched on a fair number of things, and from what you described, and get me if I'm wrong, you're largely positive on the strategy and the formulation of it and what it has put together. And I do tend to agree with you there. I think it's always hard. Like, we've been involved with building strategies for organizations, and there are always critics, right? There's always how far do you go and where do you stop? But let's just like the discussion we're having today, let's just jump into some of the more prominent criticisms that we've heard, right? And get your take on what you think of them, if you agree with them, or if you think like they're probably going too far. So one of the more prominent criticisms that have just come out, and including in some notable newspapers, is around the mandatory versus voluntary aspect of it. And you touched upon that, right? In terms of like pushing mandatory requirements might be counterproductive. But the narrative then is there, we've tried the voluntary approach for all these years, and it hasn't moved dial materially for a lot of areas. And in fact, if you look at Australia, we look at financial services as being, one of the more mature industries. It has been driven by good regulations like CPS 234 by our regulator APRA. That set the tone for the industry, and it elevated the role of cybersecurity to that board level conversations, which we've been clamoring for a long time, and it finally happened. And now slowly with the SOCI, the Security of Critical Infrastructures Act, and some other notable statements by ASIC and others, like people are getting a hand that actually is a board responsibility. So regulations did change the dial there. It were principles based; they were not prescriptive, but they still were mandatory from that perspective. Now, the idea here is, and in fact, one of the examples call out was we stopped short of making the large tech houses accountable for the software they produce, right? Instead, we went down that road of a voluntary code for app makers. And then a voluntary guide for labeling the cyber, what do they call them? The cyber safety of devices, the IoT devices and other devices. So it was a voluntary scheme attached to it. So what are your thoughts on that, David? That specific criticism of voluntary versus mandatory?
Look, I think that's the embryo of something that will grow and will mature over time. I really do. I think mandating something like that now would actually cripple a lot of organizations. And I think, the message I give to people listening to this, if you're in one of those organizations, think about how you're going to have to comply to this much further down the track. I think it's only a matter of time, but I think we're taking a measured approach to get there. I really do. And, putting the onus on the big software shops all the time, I think it's, there's a piece around absolutely. I mean, for me, vulnerabilities in code is just an indication of poor software quality, right? That's all that is. So look, there's a lot more we can do there, but I think the message will be heard. And actually, we're starting to see companies start to do this. Like, let's talk about SBOMs, right? We're starting to see what is the makeup of the code so that organizations can make informed risk decisions around that. Now, the implementation of SBOMs is tough, but we need to get through there. I think there's more good work here to be done, but I really do think that the measured approach needs to be there, particularly if you think about Australia and our current capability. One of the shields is around sovereign capabilities. So that's really supporting a lot of our small startups. It's going to take them some time to be able to respond to this and build that into their process. So I think the measured approach is right for now. I don't expect it to last. I think it will evolve over time.
And I really like that you brought the sovereignty aspect of it, and it's an important one. And obviously, in your role, the hats that you wear is mentoring entrepreneurs, contributing to the startup ecosystem in Australia. You're obviously very close to it. And and this is my personal view, is I felt that historically, Australia, we as a country haven't been as supportive of our entrepreneurs as we should be. And I think that dial is now changing, which is really heartening to see. That being said, one of the other criticisms that has come about from the industry and our peers is the composition of the Executive Cyber Council and the lack of kind of transparency around that. And it's almost the idea of is there a voice for the small, medium businesses? Is there a voice for the startup ecosystem in that? Or is it still largely dominated by the traditional big voices in the space who we've seen, large consultancies, large, bigger organizations? What are your thoughts on that criticism, David?
Well, I think it's a fair point, right? I think what we're waiting to hear is what will that makeup actually look like? That is to be formed. That's an action to be taken by the government. I think a strategy is a vision statement. This is where we want to be, and these are the milestones we're going to take to get there. Now comes the hard work, which is the implementation and the execution of that strategy. And part of that will be standing up this governance committee or this cybersecurity committee. Part of it will be the execution of these projects and programs that are going to have to be rolled out and implemented. And I think the challenge I give to government on this will be, how are they going to be communicating that progress transparently to the country, to our residents, to our citizens, and to industry? If you have a look at the strategy, I think it's a 64-page document. There's a lot of action items and specific actions government will take. Now this is where the rubber hits the road, and we're going to start to formalise these programs, resource these programs, allocate activity, and come up with some methodologies and approaches to do this. For me, I'm a wait and see. I don't want to necessarily criticise what that's going to be. I think they're working through it, and I think that's okay. And I know it's the Australian Cybersecurity Coordinator that is working on that and pulling together what that committee will look like. So I think it's a matter of time, but it's a fair call out. We need to make sure that all stakeholders are equal, represented fairly.
And I think it's a right tone, right? It's exercising that patience. I think this is a big, long endeavor that we are starting on. Is not, expecting everything to be perfect upfront is not realistic. I, in fact, think it's actually really positive. Even the action plan that accompanies the strategy document, by the way, yes. I think it's really good. Like, they've gone out and actually at least taken the first step of putting some success measures, if we call them that, some measures of who's accountable, which agency will take the lead, who's supporting. I think that goes to show that there is a thinking behind it, and they're committing to reviewing it every 2 years. So I think sometimes, it's easy to be critical, but when I looked at the strategy more holistically, I have to admit there was nothing there that was missing. Like, I didn't see anything glaring that they didn't think about, which is really commendable if you think about, what all goes in this modern cyber strategy and the modern digital ecosystem that we are in. They actually thought about a lot of things. Did they go in as much detail as we like? We'll see. One area which they called out, which I really like, and I want to talk to you more about, is data governance and what they put out as data classification model. Because it's been a challenge for a long time, is our data governance practices across the patch have not been mature. Some industries potentially, but many industries are still at the lower end of maturity model. And a big challenge always was historically, how do we put value on data? And, again, it's no one size fits all. Every organization comes up with something, but it helps to have some guidance. And I think that's where, when I saw that in the strategy, that was really, something positive to me. Also, the aspect of, we talk about AI all the time. We talk about artificial intelligence, using artificial intelligence. I'm not sure how you can use artificial intelligence well unless you understand your data and you have some governance around it, because it really starts with that aspect first of understanding it. So that's another precursor to it. But with that, always there are criticisms, right? There are the other side of the house is, oh, well, we're going to have more regulations. We're going to have more compliance cost or a burden of compliance, which a lot of industries are already facing and complaining against. And data governance is not just cyber, it's bigger than that. But I wanted to talk to you about this because I know you are very passionate. I've heard you speak, David, on artificial intelligence before. And I believe it was at the FST event. And you talked about data governance as a key part of that whole picture. So I know it's a topic you think about. How far do you think the government went with this idea? And do you think, what do you reckon should be the next step in the action plan to take it further even?
Look, I think that data governance and data classification, having that called out specifically in the strategy is very positive. data governance and data management is not a cybersecurity issue. It's a business issue. Businesses create data, process data to run their business. They need to understand how that is being used, why it's being used, why it's being created, and they have a fundamental obligation to protect that data. Data security is a subset, one core element of data governance. So I think at a governmental level, strategy level, pushing out guidance in that space, which like I say, I expect us to see an evolution there, and that guidance will start to become tougher over time. At least have a risk-based approach around that. I think there's a lot of focus in the strategy around critical infrastructure. My prediction is that some of these requirements and guidance expectations are going to be pushed into critical infrastructure in scope industry. So I think it's actually really good, because now we've got this guidance that's been put out that will be put out by government, which gives industries who maybe are falling under this new critical infrastructure requirement or regulation that may not have the skills and expertise. They don't have to figure it out for themselves. There's somewhere, it's a starting point for them. And I think we'll start to see those rules and that guidance toughen up a little bit. On the AI side, let's take a look at what just happened in the last week, which is the EU regulations formally being signed off at the governmental level across the EU. We've seen the risk-based model there for uses of AI that will be totally banned. We've got high-risk systems that need to meet certain expectations, and then we've got the all other. I think what we'll start to see is Australia will look to that as a point of reference as we evolve our AI regulations. And quite frankly, you said it yourself. You've heard me talk about it at these sessions, at these roundtables. AI needs some guardrails. It really does. We need to think about bias and fairness. We need to think about transparency and explainability. We need to think about accountability. So getting this regulation out there, getting that guidance out there, and look, I expect in the near future, Australia will have its own AI regulation, very similar to what we're seeing now in the EU, what we're seeing being developed in the US, what has been developed in Singapore, in India. We will follow suit as well.
You're right. It's a matter of time there. We really have to. I mean, you're right. There's so much to AI which we haven't considered and which we should. And actually, there is some good practices. Even New South Wales government and the Commonwealth have put forward, and some organizations have proactively gone and adopted some of those principles and tried to apply them to use cases. Some of our notable financial institutions and telcos have done that. So I think it's a starting point. But unless we have this, because I think to me regulations are useful when it impacts a wide population and it's a material concern for the population. That's when regulations really help. And I think AI has the potential to do that, which is why it's only fair that we start thinking about regulating it. Regulations, to its word, to our point, but sometimes you need them. And maybe on that aspect, right, we talked about the voluntary nature of the strategy, but there are some proposed mandatory aspects as well. One of them is around IoT devices, right? So it's always, and that's why I always chuckle at the criticisms, right? Because when you have a mandatory proposal put forward, then the question comes, how are you going to enforce it? How can Australia, as a smallish country from a population size perspective, dictate that to manufacturers? Wouldn't that raise costs? So it's a double-edged sword there. But what are your thoughts on the minimum requirements now coming up in that space, especially with the rising IoT devices? It's everywhere, right? All of our homes have multiple of them.
Look, I think this is part of the challenge that the government had to grapple with when they released the strategy is how much do we make mandatory and how much do we at least get it out there and start guiding and pushing people in the direction now? Like I say, we couldn't have made everything mandatory. I just don't think it'd be possible for, corporations, industry, people to be able to execute on. So they have to pick and choose their battles. I think they've done that well. In terms of seeing IoT be one of these mandatory requirements, I think it makes a lot of sense. We're talking about smart cities, smart houses. This is only going to increase and become more of a, I don't want to call it a challenge or a risk, but more relevant as we mature as a civilization, quite frankly. Maybe the civilization is a strong word, but as a community, think about it. We're talking about those smart cities. We're talking about connected smart devices to monitor traffic, for pay parking, parking meters. We're looking at better ways to conserve energy with our street lighting. If these devices are connected to an IP network, they're up for grabs from an adversary.
Yeah.
So actually mandating that, think about the billions of devices that are going to be out there before too long. We need to make sure that there's some core requirements wrapped around that. So for me, taking that risk-based approach, I think it's a smart measure to be pushing this point first before maybe we push other things.
Yes, smart measure for smart devices. I like it. I like it. And David, the other one which was proposed to be mandatory, I believe, is the no fault incident reporting. And look, it's similar to the aviation one, right? I reckon, where you look at it, you analyze it, you don't think about the fault, you think about fixing the underlying issue. But when it comes to cyber incidents, where do you think lines would kind of blur between the business autonomy aspect of it, the capability aspect of it, and the government intervention? And we'll talk separately about the incident reporting aspect, because I know there is some industries are just swarmed with the amount of different timelines that they have to meet anytime they have an incident. They're spending more time doing that as opposed to dealing with the incident. That's a problem. But let's just focus on this aspect. Is what are your thoughts, first of all, on establishing this board, which looks at the root causes more holistically?
Look, I think a no fault, no blame
principle
is exactly what we need. I spoke recently. I was in Canberra. I was with ACSC, and I met with Abigail Bradshaw, the Director General ACSC, and her or the ACSC's paramount focus is around how do we learn from everything that's going across our community? How do we push that out and work together across industry to make ourselves better? And it's not about, remember, ACSC and ASD are not a regulator. They're not going to come in and beat you up for reporting a cyber incident. That's a different government agency. And there are rules, believe it or not, people, between how government agencies are meant to share information.
Yeah.
And I think they're taking that extremely seriously, because from an ASD perspective, they don't want to be seen as a regulator. They don't want to be seen as, an information source that can get you in trouble. They want to be seen as, how do I get out there and help Australia as a nation? Yes. And they're very passionate about that. I've had personal discussions with my colleagues over there, and I think this is something that we need to embrace and support.
No. And I do completely agree with you. Having had interactions with them, having seen even the evolution of the SOCI Act over this time, like the amount of engagement that they have tried to do, and the positive messaging around it. I mean, yes, there are always challenges, but by and large, this is a good thing, right? We have been asking for this. We've been asking for more support, and you can't really have it, both ways. If you want more support, then you have to share as well. Yes. And I think that's the key here. So I'm in agreement with what you're saying there, David. The other one is around threat intelligence, and I bring that up in this context because it's similar. Like, it still relies on the sharing and analysis capability. Now, ISAC's information sharing and analysis centers have been running for a while in the US. In fact, they've been running for a long time. I used to be a member of one of those, and then even in Australia. Now, the government said that they're going to focus on this whole of government threat intelligence, whole of industry threat intelligence, and they're going to start first with healthcare ISAC, and it's a good place to start in my view, because if you look at some of the studies. I believe it's IBM cost of data breach. If I'm getting it right, they called out, the cost of data breach, average cost in healthcare is more than twice what the average is generally, which is in the $4 million range. So it's always been a vulnerable area, and it's been a vulnerable area for the legacy implications, the poorly secured OT systems, cybersecurity being a bolt-on in many cases, so historical reasons and current challenges that they face. Ransomwares have hit them hard, despite ransomware operators initially saying
Yes.
they won't go after this. Well, that's clearly not the case. They
We
have
know
gone
that's
after them.
true. Yep.
So, threat intelligence. What are your thoughts on the ISAC model emerging further? But David, more so, right? How do small and medium businesses benefit from it? Because I know we've been part of bigger businesses and they get access to it. The small ones still don't. They still get those ACSE alerts, which are very vendor specific, and sometimes they tune those out because they see something Cisco, I don't run Cisco. They see something some other vendor, I don't run that. Where do you think that happy balance is?
It's a really good question. I think funny that you use that health is where they're going to start, because health itself is a complex issue. And how do you build a program for health across the country with multiple states? It's a complex issue itself. And cybersecurity is, I sort of see cyber and health similar in that space. It's such a complex issue. And, there's so many, the devil's always in the detail with that. What I will say about information sharing and proactive blocking, which is part of that shield, I think it's extremely important. So you spoke about the ISACs. I was lucky to be involved in a piece of work which ran out of FS ISAC out of the US, a piece of work called FSARC, where the 5 big banks got together, worked with Homeland Security, Secret Service, FBI, and we stood up this joint threat sharing facility in Alexandria, Virginia. And that was to really drive public-private partnership and collaboration and threat sharing in that space to be able to take more proactive action. So it's great to see that being a focus here in Australia. That was one of my, early on observations when I first returned back to Australia in 2018 and helped spawn some of that conversation. Great to see it taking to the next step. Your point is absolutely spot on, though, is how does small, medium-sized business absorb some of that? And I think there's a complexity too. You mentioned FSARC. We've got critical infrastructure ISAC. We've got a retail ISAC. So we've got a bunch of these different ISACs. How do we start to get, how much of that is dual reporting or multiple copies of the same thing? How are we getting true consistency and real value add by doing this without duplicating and reducing that duplication so that it is more targeted, more focused, and it weeds out some of that noise. So I think that's a piece for any of the ISAC or large industry. I think for small, medium-sized businesses, I think it will be tough. But I think it's sort of that comes back to how does small, medium-sized business think about managing cybersecurity for themselves anyway. I think when we talk about there's more than 2 million small, medium-sized businesses in the country, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for how do we provide, whether that's industry and for the commercial benefit or whether that's some services that government might provide. And we've already seen in the strategy that government will provide some risk assessments for small and medium-sized business. So I think there's more work to be done to figure out how we do that more effectively. But I think there's opportunity for more shared service capability for small, medium business. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to truly effectively do it, in my opinion.
No, it's a fair point. And I do like, we'll get to funding because I'm still a bit concerned about what I've seen in terms of the funding allocated. The cyber health checks are a good start. Also, the one-stop shop for cyber advice, which is good, right? Small and medium businesses need that. They will benefit from them because I do find a lot of them still stuck with your managed IT providers who now taken on a security hat and are still not delivering the value that they should get. I think that'll come with maturity. But what do you think about the funding allocated to this, David? I know it's early days. Maybe there might be other mechanisms, but I saw the initial numbers. And even for just small, medium businesses, like you said, 2 million, what is circa 6 odd million allocated? So obviously not enough.
I think it's 17.2 that's allocated for the risk assessments.
Okay.
That is my question in terms of how is the funding going to be allocated to this, how it's going to be prioritized. Is it really enough? Remember that additional, I think it was 537 million that's been allocated. That's already in addition to the existing 2.3 billion. right, that was already previously committed. So all up, we're talking about 2.9 billion
Right.
for an overarching cybersecurity strategy that's going to hit the country. Understanding how that is broken down and allocated, I think, is sort of a missing piece for me. I don't think I'm not clear on how that's going to be allocated. I do question the 17.2 million that's been allocated for the risk assessments of small, medium-sized business, when we're talking about 2 million small, medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, no.
Can't see that. I don't know. I'll be interested to see how far that stretches. But again, there's a lot of devil in the detail yet to unfold. And I don't want to be critical. I respect our colleagues in the government. There's a lot of smart people in there thinking very hard about this problem, and they've demonstrated that they care about it. Let's give them some time and let's see it unfold. And more importantly, let's make sure we support them as an industry. This is not just let's wait for government and come out and criticize them. What are we doing as professionals in this industry to support them and tightly collaborate and help solve these problems with them? For me, that's massively important.
Completely agree. We can't just think about it all being government. And they've said, actually, they've come out and said this multiple times, is they see industry as leading the charge, as working with them. So I think we have a cyber strategy as a country. We know what the priorities are. We know areas which we respectfully can help in. Let's start going in there. And I know government's been encouraging us to, contribute, to collaborate, to reach out. I think there are not enough excuses that people shouldn't be doing it. I mean, just poking holes at something is easy. It's to work around it. Conscious of time, David, there's one area that I want to cover before we close out, and that's the area which I really enjoyed apart from data governance and other things. I'll always enjoy cyber, right? So that's a given. But the ones which are close to cyber but not always cyber, that's the one I pay attention to, and that is around expansion of the digital ID program. Really awesome, right? That's something which I'm just so tired of us giving our all these documents for reasons we never should, and then they get breached, and then we try to issue new licenses in another never-ending drama. However, with all of this, I mean, I wanted to play the devil's advocate because you hear the other side, right? And the other side's been shouting out loud about concerns of surveillance and privacy with that. What are your thoughts, David, on the expansion of digital ID program and its implications on surveillance and privacy?
Yeah, look, I think, to be honest, I think it's a bit, what's the word I want to use? I think people are being a little bit too concerned over that issue. I think they don't understand what digital ID actually means. So let's take a step back and truly break that down. The point of digital ID is to have a number of known good authentication services. When I talk about authentication services, I don't mean logging on to a system. What I mean is proving that David Fairman is David Fairman. We know that the individual on the end of this transaction is that person. Who are really good at doing that? The banks. That's a whole, that is KYC, so know your customer. So when you want to go and open a bank account, you need to prove who you are with government issued IDs, etc. The 100-point system. Now, if we can tie that, and remember, we're already giving these institutions our information. How often do we need to validate who we are to do work with government or with other, other service providers? We give our passports, our driver's license away multiple times. Now, hang on, if we can just do that once and use that institution or that service as a centralized service to authenticate us and validate us across multiple services, we're reducing the amount of data that's being held across multiple companies that could be impacted by an attack. Let's reduce that attack surface for a start. And that's the point of digital ID. Other countries have done it very, very successfully. It's great to see us moving forward. If we look at the two banks that have, really moved the charge there, National Australia Bank and CBA, they're moving that charge. Australian Banking Association is fully supporting that program, and you'll start to see Westpac and ANZ follow suit as well. And it's about the fact that we can use these services to authenticate ourselves across other services without having to give our information out all the time. That's what digital ID is. It's not about a centralized database that the government holds that's there to surveil us. That's not what it is.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that clear, because I think that's where the confusion arises. And I get it, right? I mean, there's always going to be a section of society which is concerned, and fair enough. But yeah, this is not that. This is not, this is for, if anything, we should be more concerned about our paper documents being just held without reason everywhere, which puts us at even more risk than something like this ever would. In fact, it's going to help out a lot of organizations by it, because we've been clamoring for it. Really, we've been asking for it for a long time now. Is why do we still have to hand over so many documents? Even if in fact, in New South Wales, we've been lucky that we've actually started to innovate on this front before, and there are some good ministers like former Minister Victor Dominello, who led the charge. There's good work which is being taken forward, so we've seen it work. And there are other countries where there's actually this ID and it works out just fine. And has helped and created more services and more benefits for the citizenry, because there was a mechanism like this that existed. So I think the concerns, people should just read a bit more about it and get more informed, and that'll allow. Look, there's fair place for criticism. We should always be open to criticize when we don't like something, but let's understand what it is before we jump on that. David, look, we're getting close to the time, and you've been very gracious as always with the time. Anything that you want to call out as we close this out? I didn't want to open another Pandora's box here. We didn't talk about ransomware, but maybe that's something which you want to close out if you want to just give your thoughts. Minister O'Neill came back and talked about the fact that, if I'm getting this correct, is over the next couple of years, they see the outlawing of ransom payments. Not right now, because we just aren't that mature. Where do you think the position is in terms of what you've seen so far in the strategy, both from the no obligation reporting, but also the more proactive offensive capabilities that we will take, so that this nuisance is tackled at the source without it reaching us?
Look, a lot there to unpack in just that one statement.
Yeah.
In terms of where we are from ransomware, I don't think we can ban those payments yet. I think we need to uplift our capabilities across our institutions, our companies, across industry, much more broadly. But I think it's definitely a way to get there, because let's face it, criminals generally are lazy. They will, if they can't, and they're there to make financial gain. If that tap is turned off from them being, receiving that monetary payment, they'll have to go and find something else. But they will. I mean, criminals, they might be smart, but they're also they might be lazy, but they're also very smart. They'll find another way to monetize their crime. But hey, this would help in some way. But organizations aren't ready to not do that. I think it's really unfair to expect an organization that might require to pay the ransom to be able to get their business up and running. But, it should be a shot across the bow to say, hey, this is coming. What are you doing to prepare for this when it comes down? In terms of the mandatory reporting, I think we spoke about that, I think that's a positive thing. In terms of the active blocking and the more taking the fight to these adversaries or these hackers, I think it's great. I think a lot of other of our, allies have done something similar. We've been doing it for a little while. I think growing that capability and having government help as a defense. We have armies and air forces and navies to help defend our country. Having cyber defense, I think, is massively important, and sometimes that requires taking a preemptive strike.
Yeah. No, well said. And I do agree. I think we got to get to a level of maturity first before we start doing that. The counter ransomware initiative, which multiple countries came together, including Australia, I think we're setting the tone well. But yeah, we're not to that stage where we can outlaw it just yet. But knowing that we got to do more, we can't have that basic posture not present. I think there are less excuses for that now than there were in the past. So I think that's a message to all of us. Look, David, I want to say a massive thank you again. Your time is invaluable, and we really appreciate you sharing your candid thoughts. Very informative, very insightful as always. But I love the fact that we discuss so many, criticism that people have in the closed doors, but don't come out and say. And we talked about them openly. And I think, all in all, we both largely agree. This is a positive strategy, a positive story. Yes, there'll be lots to learn and unpack along the journey, but it's a good start, and that's what we can ask for at this point. It's a good start, it's a good tone, and that's what we needed. So thank you again, David. Really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time with the next episode. If you like what we've done, please share your thoughts, comments, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.